You didn't choose to be different. You were born into misalignment. From the beginning, something about you just didn't fit. Maybe it was the way you questioned things that others accepted. Maybe it was your silence, your intensity, your curiosity, your refusal to play along. Or maybe it was the quiet knowing inside you that couldn't be named, but always made others uncomfortable. And so the message arrived early. You are not one of us. Not always in words, sometimes in glances that lingered too long, sometimes in the subtle shift of tone when you entered the room, sometimes in the invitations that never came. This isn't just social discomfort. This is psychological fragmentation. Because when a child is repeatedly met with rejection, not for doing something wrong, but for being who they are, the nervous system encodes that rejection as a survival threat. Your body begins to interpret difference as danger. Your mind starts scanning for anything that might make you acceptable. And without realizing it, you fracture. You silence what's real and amplify what's rewarded. You become a mirror. You become a mask. You become whatever they need you to be, just to stay close to a world that was never designed to receive you. This video is for the ones who always felt like outsiders, not just left out, but misunderstood. The ones who couldn't explain why they never quite fit in, why their silence felt louder than the room, why they were always too much or not enough, depending on who was watching. It's for the black sheep, the wanderers, the ones who sensed things others didn't and paid the price for it. Not with violence, but with exclusion, with side eyes, with tight smiles, with being tolerated, never embraced. You were told it was your fault, too sensitive, too weird, too intense. So you tried to shrink, to fit in. But no matter how small you made yourself, you could still feel the difference. If that's you, stay with me. Because what if the pain of not belonging was actually the beginning of something sacred? Carl Jung warned, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But what happens when the very self you are meant to accept was never welcomed to begin with? This is the psychological origin of the strategic outsider. Not someone who chose solitude, but someone exiled into it. Not someone who doesn't care about connection, but someone whose nervous system has learned that connection requires a kind of death. This isn't just about loneliness, it's about identity distortion. When you're always on the outside, you stop seeing yourself clearly. You begin to wonder, is something wrong with me? Why am I always too much or not enough? Why does my presence feel like a problem? And that's the most dangerous part. The longer you are unmirrored, the more fragmented you become. Because identity is built through reflection, and when you only ever see yourself through the eyes of rejection, you start to believe rejection is who you are. Psychologist Donald Winnicott called this the birth of the false self, a psychological mask worn to preserve attachment, even if it means erasing the real you. And Jung called this the beginning of the shadow, the parts of the self pushed into the unconscious to keep the ego intact. But that shadow never stays quiet. It leaks in the form of anxiety, in the form of shame, in the form of chronic self-doubt that whispers, "You don't belong here. You never did." But here's what no one tells you. Not belonging isn't failure. It's feedback. It's not a flaw in your design. It's a rupture in the system that tried to contain you. You weren't meant to blend in. You were meant to disturb the pattern. Because when you come into this world with eyes that see too much, with a heart that refuses to harden, with a mind that doesn't conform, you become a threat to people who have built their safety on illusion. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "Hell is other people." But it's not because people are evil. It's because they project their expectations onto you, like mirrors you never asked to hold. They don't see you. They see the version of themselves they want you to reflect. And when you don't reflect it, they recoil. They call you weird. They call you intense. They call you difficult, disobedient, too sensitive, too serious, too deep. But what they really mean is, you remind me of the truth I've spent my whole life avoiding. They called you different. But what if different was a sign you were already ahead of your time? What if the reason you never belonged was because belonging always came with a price you couldn't afford to keep paying? But here's where it gets even more dangerous. Because when you are forced to choose between being accepted or being yourself, something inside you always has to die. And most people don't even realize what they're sacrificing until it's already gone. So the question is this: what happens to a person when the need to belong keeps colliding with the truth of who they are? That's where we go next. You learn early. Fitting in means survival. That if you just laugh at the right moments, mirror the right opinions, dull your edges just enough, maybe they'll let you stay. You trade little parts of yourself for a seat at the table. A belief here, a truth there, a silence that feels too familiar. And at first it works. People stop asking questions, the room feels warmer. You start to think, maybe this is what being loved feels like. But there's a problem. It's not you they're accepting. It's the version of you that you constructed to make them comfortable. So you sit at the table, full, surrounded, and starving. Because when belonging comes at the cost of authenticity, you don't feel connection. You feel performance. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote that the deepest form of despair is to choose to be someone else and succeed. You don't just lose yourself by being rejected. You lose yourself when you're rewarded for being someone you're not. And for a while, you think the reward is worth it, until it starts to hollow you out from the inside. This is where the core wound forms, a fracture between two primal needs: the need to belong, tribal safety, social survival, and the need to be authentic, to express the truth of your being. Psychologists call this self-alienation, the slow, quiet death of the inner voice. You're still functioning, still smiling, still approved of, but you feel like a ghost wearing your own skin. You wake up one day and realize you've mastered the art of being acceptable, but you've forgotten how to be alive. Let's pause here, because this part is where most people unconsciously split. They start fragmenting themselves into categories of, this part is safe to show. That part must stay hidden. You stop showing your depth because it confuses people. You stop showing your ambition because it threatens them. You stop showing your sensitivity because they call it weakness. You learn to amputate the very traits that make you whole, just to be let in. But here's the paradox. The more you perform for belonging, the less truly loved you ever feel. Because love that depends on your disguise isn't love at all. Carl Jung called this the crisis of individuation, the painful but necessary journey of becoming who you actually are, rather than who the world told you to be. Individuation is violent in its clarity. It demands you walk away from validation. It demands you risk exile. It demands you shed the costumes of fitting in. And that's why most people never complete it. They stay locked in a cycle of approval addiction, trading their truth for applause. But applause never fills the hole left by self-abandonment. And belonging that isn't based on who you really are, is just captivity in disguise. So if you felt like you don't belong, maybe it's because your soul refuses to be domesticated. Maybe it's because you were never meant to adapt to dysfunction. Maybe your very refusal to betray yourself isn't a flaw, but a signal. A quiet, sacred rebellion. But here's where it gets brutal. Because when you finally stop performing, when you finally choose authenticity over approval, you start losing people. Fast. And that's where the real test begins. Because now you're not just facing rejection. You're facing the terrifying possibility that you might actually be better off alone. So what happens when you finally stop begging to belong, but you're not yet sure who you are without it? You've felt it before. You just didn't have the words. Let's go there. There comes a moment, not loud, not cinematic, but still devastating. A quiet, creeping realization. I don't know who I am anymore. At first, it presents as exhaustion. You stop wanting to show up. You feel heavy in places that shouldn't feel anything. Then comes the disorientation. You forget what you actually think, because you've lived so long inside other people's preferences. Eventually, you stop trusting yourself altogether. You second-guess your intuition. You hesitate before speaking. You shrink from your own reflection. This is the collapse of the false self. And it's not failure. It's the first step toward truth. In psychology, this collapse often mimics a crisis. What looks like burnout, depression, or numbness is often something deeper. The psyche revolting against the lie. The mind can tolerate repression for a while, but the soul keeps score. And when it finally reaches its threshold, it doesn't whisper. It breaks. You lose the ability to keep performing. You lose interest in the roles you once played. You stop being able to pretend that the approval was enough. The world calls it a breakdown. But underneath, it's an unmasking. French philosopher Albert Camus called this moment the revolt. A confrontation with the absurd, when the self realizes that meaning cannot be handed to you and must instead be forged. In that void, you see the machinery of your own conditioning, the scripts you inherited, the costumes you wore, the rules you followed for love, safety, and validation. And suddenly, none of it fits anymore. The identity you curated to survive, it becomes unbearable. Why? Because it was never yours to begin with. Let's stop here for a second, because this is where most people turn back. They feel the mask slipping, but instead of facing the rawness underneath, they reach for another performance, a new identity, a fresh disguise. But that's not healing. That's rebranding your dysfunction. And you weren't born to be a chameleon. You were born to remember. When the false self collapses, it's terrifying, but sacred. You're not losing who you are. You're losing who you never were. The caretaker, the peacemaker, the success story, the easy one. Roles you were praised for, but never truly seen in. Roles that became prisons. And here's the paradox. You don't even realize how much you've contorted yourself until your body starts rejecting the performance. Your nervous system revolts. Your voice shakes when you try to speak your truth. Your body panics in rooms where your silence used to keep you safe. That's not weakness. That's intelligence. your soul is trying to warn you. Belonging that requires betrayal isn't belonging. It's bondage. So what now? You're raw. You're untethered. You're stripped of the masks that once earned you love. But here's the moment most people miss. That collapse isn't the end. It's the clearing, a brutal, sacred reset that forces you to confront this question. Who am I when I stop being who they wanted me to be? Because now you're no longer playing by their rules. But the game doesn't end here. In fact, this is the point where it truly begins. Because when everything you thought you were falls apart, you finally become free to rebuild something real. But what do you build? And how do you know if it's really you this time? Let's unravel that now. When the mask falls, what's left isn't clarity. It's chaos. The world doesn't pause to help you rebuild. It keeps spinning. People keep expecting you to play the part. But now, the script is gone. This is the threshold no one prepares you for. The sacred in-between, where you are no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming. And it is here, in this unbearable liminality, that the real work begins. Not to find yourself, but to create yourself. Let's be honest, we romanticize self-discovery, as if it's a scenic hike, as if journaling and moonlight will reveal our truth. But real individuation, as Carl Jung called it, is brutal. It's not about adding new traits to your personality. It's about subtraction, peeling away the inherited, the imposed, the expected. It's not becoming your best self. It's burning down the false self so your original self can speak. And that voice? At first, it barely whispers, because it's been silenced for years. Jung believed that the path to wholeness required us to face the shadow, the unconscious parts of ourselves we disowned to be loved, accepted, or safe. But here's the twist. The shadow isn't just darkness. It also contains our forgotten light, your creativity, your rage, your instincts, your boundaries, your birthright to say no and not apologize. So when you begin this sacred search, you're not just recovering a personality, you're recovering power, the kind you buried to be who they needed you to be. There's a reason this phase feels like grief. Because it is. You grieve the years you spent performing. You grieve the people who only loved the mask. You grieve the dreams you chased that were never yours. But this grief, it is holy. Because for the first time, it belongs to you. It's not rehearsed. It's not for show. It's not curated for someone else's comfort. It's yours. And through it, you begin to build something sacred. A self that doesn't need permission to exist. Here's where most people get stuck. They confuse freedom with isolation. Because when you stop conforming, you start losing people. The invitations stop, the texts slow down, the room feels colder. But that isn't rejection, it's refinement. You're shedding the false mirrors, the ones that only reflected you when you were convenient, palatable, agreeable. And in that absence, you start to feel something new. Silence, but not emptiness. Solitude, but not loneliness. Stillness, but not despair. That is the self emerging from the wreckage. And it's not demanding attention. It's demanding truth. This part of the journey is spiritual, not in the woo-woo sense, but in the existential sense. Because when you are no longer performing for the tribe, you must confront a terrifying truth. You are responsible for your life now. No more scapegoats. No more people-pleasing. No more waiting for someone else to name your worth. This is where Kierkegaard enters the conversation. He wrote of the leap of faith, the terrifying choice to live authentically without guaranteed outcomes, validation, or applause. This is the cost of self-possession. To risk being misunderstood in exchange for never abandoning yourself again. So you begin to choose differently, not to prove your worth, but to honor it. You walk away without begging. You speak without softening your truth. You no longer contort yourself to be digestible to people who never truly saw you. You stop asking, "How do I belong here?" and instead ask, "Does this belong to me?" Because the goal isn't to be included everywhere. The goal is to be entire somewhere. And sometimes, that somewhere starts inside you before it ever echoes in the outside world. You're not lost, you're between versions. And in this sacred search, you're not building a brand, you're building a soul. But what happens when the world around you still wants the old version? What do you do when they try to pull you back into the costume? Let's go deeper, into the part most people avoid. You've changed, but they haven't. And now, you're about to meet the most dangerous kind of resistance. Not the world before you awakened, but the world that preferred you asleep. Because here's the truth no one warns you about. Once you reclaim yourself, you become inconvenient to the people who benefited from your silence. It starts subtly. A comment that sounds like a joke, but lands like a warning. You've changed. You hear the edge in their tone. It's not admiration, it's disappointment. What they really mean is, you've stopped complying. You no longer make me comfortable. You're not performing the role I cast you in. And they'll frame it like concern. They'll say you've gotten cold, distant, difficult. But it's not that you're difficult. It's that you've stopped making their life easy by sacrificing yours. This is where most people shrink. Not because they're weak, but because they still want love. They still crave belonging. And on some level, they hope the people in their lives will celebrate this new version of them. But that's not how it works. When you grow, you create contrast. And contrast threatens comfort, especially for those who haven't changed. Let's pause here. This part hurts deeply. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because now you're seeing the truth. You were accepted conditionally. Not because of who you are, but because of who you pretended to be. That's the psychological fracture point. You realize you weren't truly loved. You were used. Not always maliciously, sometimes unconsciously, but used nonetheless for your empathy, your flexibility, your ability to disappear. This is the collision point of two competing forces, your individuation and their projection. Jung warned of this. He said that those who individuate often become scapegoats, targets of projection by those who refuse to face their own shadow. And that's what begins to happen. They'll say, "You're so full of yourself now. You think you're better than us. You've changed." Translation: you're reflecting back what they've suppressed. And they don't want the mirror, they want the mask. So they'll provoke you, to get you to react, to pull you back into the old script. Because if you argue, if you explain, if you over-explain, you've already lost. You're back in character. The real test here isn't just spiritual, it's somatic. Because your nervous system still remembers what it feels like to be punished for having needs. So even when you know better, your body flinches. You shrink, even slightly. You try to manage the tension. You soften your truth, just enough to stay safe. But that's the moment to pause, to breathe, to stay still. Because this isn't just a social moment. It's a moment of repatterning. You're teaching your body, I can survive not being liked. I can survive not being approved of. I can survive standing in my truth, even when it makes others uncomfortable. And slowly, those survival responses lose their grip. Because authenticity, practiced consistently, becomes its own safety. Camus once wrote that the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. That is what you are now. A walking contradiction, a sacred disruption, a reminder that someone can wake up and never fall back asleep. You are what they fear, not because you're dangerous, but because you're free. And freedom is contagious. But here's where the final trap lies. You will be tempted to prove yourself, to justify your change, to convince others you're still good, still kind, still worthy. But let's be blunt. Your healing doesn't need PR. You don't need to host a press conference every time you set a boundary. You don't need to explain your self-worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. You're not selfish for changing. You're sacred for surviving. And if that disrupts the comfort of those around you, that's not cruelty. That's consequence. This is the great paradox of transformation. You become more whole and more alone. But this isn't loneliness. It's sacred separation. The cocoon before emergence. The silence before resonance. Because what happens next isn't a return to the tribe. It's the creation of a new one, not based on performance, but on resonance. But how do you find that? Keep listening. This is where it begins to shift. So what happens now? You've stepped away from the crowd. You've broken the pattern. You've survived the silence that follows individuation. But here's the next question. Where do you belong in a world that never made space for who you truly are? Because it's not enough to leave the old story. At some point, you must begin to write a new one. And this is the hardest part of all. You're no longer trying to fit in, but you're still human. You still ache for connection. You still long to be seen, not through the eyes of projection, but through the lens of recognition. And that's where many people fall back into old roles. Because the loneliness feels unbearable. But pause here. Because this isn't loneliness, it's interstitial space. You've left the false home, but you haven't found the real one yet. Psychologically, this is what Victor Turner called liminality, a threshold state between identities, between worlds, between selves. It's disorienting by design, because you're shedding every mask, every role, every learned loyalty that kept you safe, but not sovereign. This phase is often mistaken for regression. Friends ask why you're withdrawing. Family wonders if something's wrong. Even you start to question whether you've made a mistake. But this isn't collapse. This is recalibration. And to survive it, you must understand the deeper architecture of meaning. You are not here to re-enter the world on its terms. You are here to reimagine the world on yours. This requires something most people never fully embody: self-sourcing. Instead of asking, "Where do I belong?" you begin to ask, "What kind of world would I belong to? And how can I build it, even in miniature, right now?" This is not a grand revolution. It's a subtle reorientation. It's choosing resonance over recognition, alignment over approval, essence over performance. And it begins with a single act: making your inner truth more real than your outer noise. That's not a spiritual metaphor. It's a psychological rewire. Because for most of your life, your safety has been external. Fitting in, being liked, not causing waves. But now, your safety is internal. It's the quiet knowing, I can be all of who I am, even if no one claps. And paradoxically, that's when the right people start to find you. Not because you're louder, but because you've stopped distorting your signal to fit someone else's station. Let's go deeper. There's a concept in Jungian psychology called the self, the archetypal totality of who you are, beyond ego, beyond trauma, beyond the identities you inherited. The more you align with this inner compass, the less the world's confusion can destabilize you. It doesn't mean you won't feel pain. It means the pain won't define you. You are no longer an actor in someone else's dream. You are the dreamer, conscious, lucid, aware. And from that place, belonging becomes a different equation. It's not about who accepts you. It's about who recognizes the truth in you because they've seen it in themselves. These people, they don't ask you to shrink. They don't punish your growth. They don't flinch when you speak from your core. They are rare, but they are real. And you won't find them by searching. You'll find them by becoming. Because resonance is a frequency. And once you hold your own, consistently, unapologetically, you become a beacon, a mirror, a lighthouse for others who are also walking away from the world to finally meet themselves. This is your place now. Not in the center of the crowd, but at the edge of the map. Not defined by consensus, but by coherence. Not surviving on borrowed identities, but thriving in your own sacred strangeness. Because what if you never belonged because you were never meant to? What if the ache to fit in wasn't a flaw, but a signal? Not to mold yourself tighter, but to expand so fully that the world around you has no choice but to shift. The most important piece? That's still ahead. Let's breathe here, because maybe, for the first time, you're starting to see it clearly. You weren't broken. You weren't cursed. And you were never too sensitive, too intense, too much. You were simply awake, in a world that wanted you numb. You felt things others refused to name. You questioned what others blindly obeyed. You couldn't contort yourself into the shapes they celebrated, not because you failed, but because your soul remembered something deeper. Here's the quiet truth you were never told. The ones who don't fit are not defective. They're often the ones carrying the medicine, not in a messianic way, but in a structural, psychological, intergenerational sense. Because when a system, whether it's a family, a community, or a culture, is built around suppression, silence, or performance, it needs someone to start glitching, someone who stops complying, someone who starts asking dangerous questions, someone whose body starts to reject the role they were assigned. And that someone was you. This is what it means to be the pattern breaker. You weren't born to carry on the lineage of dysfunction. You were born to interrupt it. Not just by walking away, but by metabolizing the unspoken, by giving language to what no one else dared name, by holding the mirror that others spent their lives avoiding, not out of vengeance, but out of vision. And that's why it hurt so much. Because the system doesn't bless the breaker, it punishes them. It calls them selfish, unreasonable, disloyal, overdramatic. But if you hadn't broken, the pattern never would have. This is where the narrative shifts from pain to power. You didn't just survive being misunderstood. You alchemized it. You took the shame that was handed to you and transmuted it into self-respect. You questioned the rules not to rebel, but to return to something real. That inner truth, that core signal, that sacred refusal to abandon yourself again. And now? Now the path ahead is different, because you no longer need permission to exist. You're not performing for safety. You're not shape-shifting to be liked. You're not silencing your knowing to make others comfortable. Instead, you are living from the inside out. That's not a poetic idea. It's a full-body strategy. It's what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, beneath the noise, beneath the conditioning, beneath the masks you were taught to wear. And as you do, something radical happens. You stop looking for belonging and start radiating it. Because people don't truly connect with perfection. They connect with truth. And when your truth is no longer hidden, it becomes a tuning fork for every other soul who's been waiting for someone, anyone, to go first. This is what it means to become a lighthouse. Not loud, not forceful, just steadfast, visible, unshaken in your frequency, a beacon for the ones still trapped in roles they didn't choose, still apologizing for their depth, still believing that not fitting in is a flaw instead of a feature. They'll see you, not because you demanded it, but because your existence made something in them remember. And that's how the healing spreads. Not through control, not through persuasion, but through presence. So if you still sometimes wonder, why didn't they love me as I was? Why did I have to walk this path alone? Why did it hurt so badly just to be myself? Remember this. It wasn't because you were unworthy. It was because you were ahead of schedule. You were trying to plant new roots in soil that wasn't ready. But that doesn't make you broken. It makes you a forerunner, a builder, a new ancestor. Not of blood, but of truth. Pause here with me. Let this land. You were never the problem. You were the portal. And now that you've remembered this, you'll never abandon yourself again. Not for comfort, not for love, not for anything that asks you to shrink. Because you're not just healing yourself anymore. You're building a world where others like you won't have to beg for belonging again. Where difference isn't punished, but protected. Where truth isn't diluted, but devoted to. Where the ones who never fit finally come home.